podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck. So this week's episode all stems from the fact that a legend, an icon, if you will, not of Gen X as a person, since they themselves were a boomer, but I think is ingrained in I think our childhoods, either first run or in reruns, but certainly also as a singer. And on January 4th of this year, David Soul passed away at the age of 80 years old. 80 years old. I think that he is obviously most well known for Starsky and Hutch as far as a big star role. Now, here's the thing. That show only lasted for about 4 years. But he was also the lead in Salem's Lot. So the Stephen King TV adaptation with one of the most terrifying and frightening scenes in the history of movies. And I believe that Salem's Lot was directed by Tobe Hooper, who's also pretty well known for, movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. But David Soul was known for that, as well as being, one of the bad guys in a Dirty Harry movie in 1973's Magnum Force. And I mentioned it when we did, what year was this? One of the 1970s episodes that I did as far as Billboard. And that was, he had a number one hit with Don't Give Up on Us. I mean, massive. And I don't know, it's just something so interesting about, I guess, how he was somewhat portrayed in media. I don't want to call him Lothario because, he was married 5 times. But I just think there was this kind of, I don't know, preconceived ideas kind of about who he was, I think, to some extent. But what's interesting is when you go back to Starsky and Hutch, Hutch was the smart guy, the more reserved one, leaving, Paul Michael Glazier as Starsky as being kind of the hothead, the brooding kind of, I don't know, someone describes his character as being like a whining child. It's just so interesting because I think in real life, they were probably different. I don't know. I never knew him, but first of all, just rest in peace to David Soul, who is listed as an American British actor because he did spend the last 20 years of his life as a British citizen. His longest marriage was his last marriage to Helen Schnell, who is a British citizen. And he spent the last years of his life, a lot of it on the British stage, which is just kind of cool. But, his television debut was on Flipper. He just did a lot of different stuff, everything from Star Trek to I Dream of Jeannie, Gunsmoke, All in the Family. Just really a little bit of everything. And then to have like hit singles, just kind of a cool career. But this got me thinking about Starsky and Hutch. And Starsky and Hutch made me think of iconic vehicles. Now, I'm going to put this right out there. I am not a car guy, which was probably to the great consternation of my father, and probably to some extent even, my stepdad, is that I always appreciated cars, but I never have gotten into the mechanics of it. So when I'm talking about cars this evening, I'll give you some very basic specs. Not even really basic specs. It's just going to be, hey, here's the car. It was freaking cool. Now, I had an extensive Matchbox and Hot Wheels collection. I was trying to remember the name of the British company. Let's see if I can find out real quick, because I did some other research. I guess maybe it's Oxford. I think it's Oxford, either Oxford or Atlas, that had basically they were the Hot Wheels, the Matchbox cars from Britain. And I had a couple of those in my collection. But ultimately, my whole concept of cars was really more about look and sound without ever really knowing fully what was under the hood. And I'll be honest, I've never had a great car in my entire life. So I'll just give you the quick rundown. My very first car of my own, I bought it for $500. It was a 1981 Subaru GT. No, Subaru DX. It wasn't even like a Subaru Outback. It didn't have a name. It was just Subaru DX. It was orange. It was a three-door hatchback, four-cylinder, manual transmission, just a beater, just an absolute beater. My second car ended up, it was kind of like I paid my mom a small, few bucks, whatever, for her car, which was a, excuse me, I want to say like a 85 or an 86 Ford Escort GT. Now the GT was supposed to be like the higher horsepower, which meant like 108 horsepower. Now, again, I can't tell you all the, the displacement and, the engine block and all that. I just know it was a four-cylinder and it was supposed to be a little bit, not even turbocharged, but 108 horsepower was like its max. And it looked cooler than a regular Escort, but I mean, still a Ford Escort. I had an 81 Mercury Lynx after the Ford let me down. So Mercury Lynx is basically an Escort. I feel like I had one other beater somewhere. Then like a 91 Toyota Camry. No, excuse me, a 91 Toyota Corolla. Then another Escort, which was a gift. And then a Ford Focus, which is basically like it was like the new generation of Escort. I had an 03 or an 04, something like that. Had that for like a decade. Ran it into the ground, 200,000+ miles on it. Absolutely dead. Then a Toyota Camry that I had for a number of years, probably 10 years on that. And I currently drive a 2020 Jeep Compass, and I have been nothing but displeased with it. I'll be very honest, and we're actually in the market for a new car. But again, I can't tell you all the specs. But my mom and dad divorced, when I was 2. I've mentioned that in the podcast. But each of them were kind of into cars in different ways. So my dad was actually away at college when he got the call to come home. My mom was pregnant and all that, and we can get into that another time. But he was in auto school, and he, left school to become a dad and go to work, and then they end up getting divorced. But he really didn't have a lot of excess cash. He's paying child support and all that. So his cars for my earliest years were typically hand-me-downs from my grandfather to him. Meanwhile, my mom, who's like dating this other guy and has a little bit more disposable income, I'm imagining, she had like a 70-something Mercury Cougar. Let's see, a Cougar, Mercury Cougar. So let's see. The Cougar was derived from the Ford Mustang. Let's see. Yeah, V8 engine, which will be a recurring theme tonight. So that Cougar was like this dark blue. I know she ended up getting rid of that. And then she had a Dodge Challenger. She didn't have a Charger. I think it was Challenger. Anyway, the point is, like, had a couple of nice cars. That car got totaled, the Challenger or the Charger, I forget which one. But my dad was like driving like my grandfather's hand-me-down like VW Bug. And then he had a Jeep Wrangler. Excuse me. Sorry, folks. Yeah, it's back and forth with, I think I need a humidifier is what I need. So he didn't really get his first, like, okay, the car that I really want to have until like 85, 86, which was a Chevy Camaro, which then he got custom paint, which is like this oil slick paint. So depending on which angle you looked at it, it looked like, black, but then you would see all these different like colors in it. Very cool. And then he was at a point where he could start getting vehicles that he wanted and then putting work into them. So like he had a 68 dumpster green Cadillac Coupe de Ville. He had like this like panel truck. He had his 72 or a 74 just Chevy Silverado, just a basic pickup. And then he ended up getting a 1982, which I believe was the last old school Corvette body style. But again, I couldn't tell you any of the stuff going on underneath the hoods of these cars. All I know is if it gets you to point A to point B. I was a good driver. I was a delivery driver. So very comfortable behind a wheel, but never with the mechanicals. That's what tonight's about. Iconic vehicles. Not just cars. Because there's a couple of trucks in here and a couple of different things. But I'm going to start with the honorable mentions. Herbie the Love Bug. Who doesn't love Herbie? I mean, it's a Volkswagen Beetle, and in the movies, it was anywhere from a 1961 to a 1965. This is just a simple little 4-cylinder car, and Herbie was alive. It was a sentient vehicle, and a good guy, if you will. So there's a couple of movies that were made. This is out of Disney, and they couldn't use the word Volkswagen Beetle, but you knew who it was. It was the Love Bug. And in speaking of vehicles with minds of their own, again under the honorable mentions, we have a 1958 Plymouth Fury by the name of Christine, of course coming from Stephen King's novel of the same name, about a car that was very much alive and with a little bit more murderous intentions. In fact, Christine was basically given the personality of a jealous girlfriend, if you will, and was very possessive of her owner, to much to the chagrin of everyone around, who was then, potentially killed or maimed for having any kind of interaction with her owner, which I'm forgetting the name of the kid who owned it, but he didn't make it at the end. Tragic story, if you will. On a fun, so the Plymouth Fury. So one of the things that is almost universal with most of these vehicles, obviously not the Volkswagen Beetles, but almost everything here is a V8 engine with various different size blocks. Excuse me. So basically the block size, you have like a 350 big block or a 350 small block or whatever it is about displacement. And what I think that means, and everyone can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that obviously in a combustion engine, you have a liquid that's gasoline converted to vapor, so smoke, if you will, and that goes through pistons and all that. So basically the amount of displacement, the bigger the block, the potential for higher horsepower, I think that's correct. Not even starting to get into stuff like, torque and turbocharge and carburation and all that. But my basic knowledge is different blocks, typically a V8 on these American muscle cars. Most of them are American cars, I should say, which goes ahead and provides more horsepower. You have the legendary 1979 Ford Limited Country Squire wagon, also a V8 engine from National Lampoon's Vacation. Of course, the Griswold family car. And then the last honorable mention is the oldest vehicle on the list, which is a 1950 Mercury Monterey V8 engine, and that was the car of choice of one Marion Cobretti, of course played by Sylvester Stallone in the action hit Cobra, which had one of the most badass pieces of movie poster art, like peak Stallone. He's got the gun with like the laser sight and the shades and just a complete badass. And his name was Marion, which of course was an homage to another Marion who is most well known as John Wayne. So those are the honorable mentions. So now the list I have is not really in a particular order. So of course the first one we have here, I mentioned at the start of the show, Starsky and Hutch, a 1976 Ford Gran Torino, the striped tomato, if you will, V8 engine. And it was iconic, just such an iconic looking vehicle. And, this kind of like this odd asymmetrical striping down the side. And it just looked so cool. So you're also talking about a California-based show in Starsky and Hutch. And, some of those driving scenes are crazy. So, of course, Starsky and Hutch also, you have characters like Huggy Bear. But I think it's so indicative of the time. Like, it's one of those things that you look at that vehicle and it just screams 1976. And those two guys were just, just icons, absolute icons. Now, the next one, it kind of gets, it starts getting into like time and place kind of thing. What I mean by that is a lot of people can't accept things for the time period in which they existed. And to me, that's very important because I don't think that you can apply things. I talk about, the model moral aesthetic. So applying modern morality to things. And I just don't think, I think that any art, no matter what it is, can be appreciated for the time in which it was created. No matter what, modern scholars, it's usually academics. And I don't say that dismissively. I mean, I've gotten 2 degrees. It's not as though I dismiss the potential power of education. And I loved learning and I love my master's program even more than my undergrad. But the 1969 Dodge Charger from the Dukes of Hazzard, the General Lee has become kind of a symbol in a lot of people's minds, or some people's minds. I shouldn't even say a lot, because it represented the General Lee, who was, the South's general in the Civil War, and it had the Confederate flag. Now, these are 2 country boys living in Hazzard County who I don't think, at least the way the show was represented, that was indicative of a mindset that made them hateful. I just think it was like this kind of Southern pride thing. Now, bear in mind, I am Northeast through and through. Even did some like genealogy and like, it's just kind of funny. Like I did digging back, and I'm one of those American mutts where it's either I have family who came over turn of the century, like 20th century, right? So early 1900s, or people who were like here, like pre-revolutionary. It's just very strange, but it's also very American. And that's typically like the British side of the family. I think a lot of the Irish also came later, right? But nevertheless, I had ancestors who fled to Canada during the war against England because they were loyalists to the crown, which I thought was fascinating. Like, I never even thought about that. I just thought, everyone up here in New England is going to be fighting against, the king. No, they fled to Canada, and then they came back after the United States was formed, like after independence was won. Like, way to not take a side. Okay. I guess they didn't want to fight brother against brother, countryman versus countryman. So, okay. But then I have like some of my ancestors who fought in the Union, on the Union side, and against, the South. Very, very curious. But anyway, that 1969 Dodge Charger. So I think I mentioned before that for my junior prom, my girlfriend at the time, her grandfather had it was either a 67 or like a 70. It was somewhere before or after this version of the Charger. And he always called me Herbie. Now, he was very Italian, very Northeast Italian, and never called me by my name. Hey, Herbie. I'm like, yeah, what's going on? Herbie, look, you're taking Nikki. You're taking Nikki to the prom. You gotta go in a nice car. And like, he hands me the keys. Take it. I'm like, no, I can't. I can't. Take it. Take my Nikki to the prom in a nice car. You take it. You take the Charger. I'm like, are you serious? Coolest fucking thing I've ever driven. Like, without a doubt. Like, without a doubt. drove my dad's Camaro. I've been in a Porsche 911. I think it was 911. My stepdad had a white with red leather interior Porsche. He also had a Triumph TR6. So, I mean, I've driven some cool cars. Nothing was like that Charger. I mean, just the front end, just the power. There's just nothing like it. But I don't want to leave out Daisy Duke and her 1980 Jeep CJ7, which had Dixie emblazoned on the hood. I mean, it was a cool little Jeep all by itself, right? Now, I'm not going to get into like, Cooter's tow truck, like tow mater. One of the coolest things I ever had as a kid, though, and it almost made the episode for favorite Christmas toys, but I think I got it for my birthday, which was the Dukes of Hazzard slot car racers, which included Roscoe's car, his cop car. So now we have, and let me just move this one to the end of the list because I do have a favorite, and it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. So, Smokey and the Bandit, the 1977 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, but not to be forgotten, you also have the Rockford Files, and Jim Rockford, played by James Garner. So, of course, Smokey, played by Burt Reynolds. Also, the Pontiac Firebirds, all V8s. What's interesting is that in Rockford, for every year the show was on the air, they would get the latest model of Firebird, which I thought was really cool. Up until, so the last season that it ran was in 79. James Garner didn't like the 1979 Firebird, so they kept the 78 for the last season. But those are just beautiful cars. I mean, they certainly have a, I don't know, kind of a connotation, I think, in some regards, just because of the flashiness with, Phoenix Firebird on the hoods of the cars, but they're just gorgeous. Was never the car that I was my dream car, which I don't know I'll ever have it, but I always liked, a Mustang, a 1960s era Mustang. That was like my favorite Matchbox car. Like, this is what I wanted to have. I don't know if I'll ever have one, but that frickin' Firebird was definitely high on the list. So yeah, Pontiac made some amazing cars. So again, I don't know the stuff all going on under the hoods, but some of these great American car brands, which are kind of a bummer, they don't exist anymore, or they exist in like there's like these independent like kit companies. But anyway, yeah, those 1970s Firebirds were badass. And if you saw one on the street, it turned heads without a doubt. Looked cool, sounded even cooler. So then you have the car of choice for many iterations of one 007 James Bond. Now, most frequently, it was Aston Martin DB5s, for example. But it also kept going all the way up to like, Pierce Brosnan had a V12 Vanquish. Now, most of the time, this was a V6 car, a little bit smaller than the others. I think a lot of European cars tend to be a little bit smaller, more compact, but those Aston Martins are just beautiful. I don't really have much to say about it other than you turn heads when you see those as well. And the fact that it became like the car of choice for Bond, even though if you want to take a look, there's the cars of Bond, all these different vehicles that he's had, whether he had to grab them in a pinch. And that even goes like, I mentioned Jason Bourne. When I talked about like the trilogies and stuff, last week's episode, he did amazing things like Jason Bourne's character for the Mini Cooper and like that whole, chase scene through the streets of Paris. Just really cool. But anyway, yeah, the Aston Martins, can't leave that out. Now, the first truck on the list is also a bit of a kind of guilty pleasure show. So I've mentioned that my crush, where I had all these posters, was of Heather Thomas. Now, Heather Thomas was, of course, on a TV show called The Fall Guy. Now, The Fall Guy is a lead character, Lee Majors, by the name of Colt Seavers, who had a GMC K2500 Sierra Grande 350 V8 jacked up truck that was just, excuse me, sorry about that. I'm coughing, I'm belching, holy cow. But it was so cool. It was in like the opening trailer, and obviously he would jump that thing because he's a stunt man, and that was just the coolest looking truck. Ugly when you look at it from, again, a modern view, because it was brown, right? I mean, it was as ugly as could be. I mean, it's brown with, I guess it's like a faux wood grain, kind of. Or is it just really just brown with a tan piping? Yeah, I don't know. The truck made 33 jumps on screen, mostly suffering only body damage and the occasional broken ball joint. That's freaking cool, dude. That's cool. But I loved that truck. I mean, if I could get one right now, a replica of the truck just sold at auction for about $100,000. And this article, a couple years old? No, just 2023. $100,000 for the Fall Guy truck. Just a GMC 2500, basically stock, with just some beefed up frame and suspension. So cool. Now, the next one is kind of universally beloved just because it is the entire impetus for an entire series. Again, I mentioned the trilogies, and the trilogy of all trilogies is Back to the Future. Of course, talking about the 1981 DeLorean DMC-12. Now, the thing about DeLorean is that those were Ford V6 engines, and they can still be purchased via kit. So you can build yourself a DeLorean, or you can have it built for you. They'll assemble one for you, complete replicas, all the original spec, all the original plans, designs, etc. And there's a company that is making DeLoreans. What's the name of that company? Not that I'm getting anything for this, but if anyone wants to go ahead and get themselves one, you can do that. DeLorean Motor Company. Yeah, it's just, you can just get one. Let's see, what is this? Ooh. New designs. Wow. It looks as though they're developing a new one. The Alpha 5. Or you can get the classic DMC. They also buy and sell them. Huh. Pretty cool. So anyway, if you'd like to, you can get yourself a DeLorean. The fact that it became a time machine is pretty freaking cool. You know what I mean? Really cool. Now, another one of my favorites, one of my favorite series that is no longer a trilogy, by the way, and the Mad Max Pursuit Special, 1973 Ford XB Falcon GT, 351 V8. It was the last vehicle that was in their mythology, the tippy top pursuit vehicle, the Interceptor. And it was made for someone who was going to be chasing down the bad guys in this kind of new world that was unfolding post-apocalypse. And it was offered to Max as a way to appease him, but also kind of an invitation for him to become like the guy, right? Because he lost his partner, his family, everything. And he declined, right? He's like, I'm not going to be a cop anymore. Yet he went and he got that vehicle and he went and chased down the bad guys. And then it became like the vehicle, got customized even further. And then, it made a reappearance in Fury Road as well. But yeah, the Pursuit Special, the Ford Falcon, badass vehicle, looked amazing. And then they, all the work that was done on it. The carburation and turbocharging and all of it. It just It looked like the vehicle for a road warrior, am I right? I mean, it did. It was fitting. And Mel Gibson looked pretty fucking cool driving it. So then you have the first van on the list. Now, a friend of mine's family had one of these. The 1983 GMC Vandora. Now, this particular vehicle was a stock four-cylinder with the option for a V6, which, of course, was used, that V6 engine, for the A-Team. B.A. Baracus and the crew had the iconic black with red piping, just badass A-Team van. That is somewhere in Matchbox form in my house. All of my Matchbox cars are here somewhere. And yeah, the A-Team van, that was always very, very cool. Now, a lot of people had these vans. So, that's another vehicle that my dad had. I think I mentioned this on an episode when I was talking about drive-in movies, right? So I think my dad's van, I want to say it was a Dodge, maybe. Or maybe it was a Vandora. I forget. But nevertheless, he had that whole back, like custom upholstered, had like rug in it, like so many people did. Like one of my buddies when I was in Boy Scouts, his dad had a bar and cabinets and stemware. I mean, just absurd. Like, okay, dude, we know you need to drink all the time, including while you're driving. We get it. And everyone's dad did it. Okay, I shouldn't say that. Not everyone's. A lot of our dads drank when they drove. It was common. It was common. And we didn't have cup holders. So you held your beer between your legs and you drove. And unfortunately, a lot of times, those cans got tossed right out the window, littering on top of it all. Then also, sometimes, if you had to take a leak, you also pissed in the can or the bottle, and you threw that out the window. It was a different time, people. You all know. It's true. But yeah, my dad's van, I mean, that was the easiest way to pack a whole bunch of people in, head to the drive-in movie, and by placement of, pillows and blankets, it looked as though there was no one in back. You pay for the two people in the front seat, you go and watch your movie, get in there, back that sucker into the spot, open up those back doors, everyone pops out, boom, movie time. A lot of fun. Very 70s, very 80s. So then the last one I have on my list, just my own personal favorite. So again, I don't know donkey shit about what's going on under any of these hoods. The 1979 Manta Coyote from Hardcastle and McCormick. Now, I don't know how to describe this vehicle. Let's see. I will let someone else kind of explain it. So, the Coyote was a montage that had been tricked out and renamed the Coyote. But it was basically a car kit replica of the McLaren M6 GT, which I guess was based on what? Coyote was actually modified montage, a car kit replica of the McLaren, but based on the humble VW Beetle. Bruce McLaren had big plans for the original M6 GT. Plans came to a halt, this untimely death, in 1970. But thanks to Manta, this classic shape did not go quietly into the night. Contrary to popular belief, the montage is a pretty faithful representation of McLaren's original design. It shares many cues with the Porsche racing cars like the 917 and 908, but the montage seems much leaner, especially in profile. The Coyote takes the step further, removing the rear glass and emphasizing an open-air feel. The replica was professionally built and powered by a 3.3-liter GM V6. At only 1,900 pounds in weight, it flew. So anyway, I read somewhere that it was actually a V8. But yeah, I mean, it's just a beautiful vehicle. I mean, it didn't seem like anything else. Oh, I love this. Like most TV cars, this one had an unhappy ending. After Series 1 of the show, the original Coyote was replaced with a DeLorean-based car. one 80s icon masquerading as another. Brian Keith, who played Hardcastle, had difficulty climbing in and out of the first car, and the new gull-winged configuration solved this problem. But the boxy Coyote was so ill-proportioned and thrown together, even a 12-year-old like myself could tell something looked seriously wrong. After 3 series, the show was canceled, and the Cody Coyote was parked for good. So now that I'm looking at it, you can see the difference big time when they replaced it with the DeLorean. I see what they tried to do and how they tried to do it, but yeah, it just was not quite the same. But that original profile, I mean, man, oh man. Gorgeous. Such a gorgeous car. Yeah, I'm just ogling it. Sorry, I should be speaking, but I'm just going, look at that beautiful beast. Like that weird little logo, which I guess is supposed to be a coyote. Like the subtle yellow piping in it. Yeah, just so cool. Many dislike the pinstriping and side decals, but don't all TV cars need a little icing on the cake? Absolutely. The smoked headlamp lenses made a stronger impression than the clear McLaren lenses. Agreed. Yeah, the smoked headlamp lenses, very cool. Yeah, it's like no other. It's one of my favorite. It's why it's on the list. It's why I wanted to talk about it. It's one of the vehicles, along with that Gran Torino, that I couldn't help but like just love as a kid. And if you could get like either, so there was a time too that people, surprise, surprise, some of you maybe still do them, like you actually bought model kits and put those things together, like painstakingly gluing and painting. And I mean, it took a lot of time. I only did a few. I did a handful. That's a lot of work, but it was just kind of, I don't know, it was very cool because you're putting together the layers in the same way that you imagine that they're doing on the assembly line. And that's what made it such a cool experience. But yeah, there was this one in particular that I remember like painting with my dad and like each panel and like taking its time and really making sure, because using spray paint, that it's very, very smooth. Yeah, I have always loved cars while not having any inclination. I think they, in Mad Max, they use the term black thumb, right? I've never had a black thumb. Just very basic stuff I could do, I mean, obviously back in the 80s and 90s, you could go down to a junkyard and you could get parts for stuff. And just basic knowledge, you can kind of fumble your way through it. Now, obviously, I couldn't do any advanced stuff, but like basics here and there, I was able to figure out. I used to always change my own tires and stuff like that, so I'm not a complete idiot. But like my buddy would go, okay, I'll give you a tune-up, and like, because doing things like timing, like I couldn't do timing. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. You know what I mean? But yeah, cars. We had so many iconic cars, and it's funny. I mentioned that Escort GT that I had, and I remember I raced one of my buddies who had a 80-something Thunderbird, right? So Thunderbird, that was a V6 engine, rear wheel drive, and it had something like 180 horsepower. And now my GT is 108 horsepower, but sometimes it's the ability to drive that makes a difference. So we raced a couple of times, and I smoked him on the highway, mostly because I think, one, I'm driving a manual transmission and I know how to drive, and very comfortable at the high speeds. And I was driving a front wheel drive vehicle. During the wintertime, if we'd go out for the night, it would always be me driving, including in that Thunderbird, because I was comfortable driving pretty much any vehicle. But I remember thinking about how his family got new cars on the regular, whereas my family drove them into the ground, right? And I remember his mom ended up replacing her daily driver. And it was like a Toyota, might have been a Corolla or might have been a Tercel. But it was one of those first rounded kind of bodies that was starting to happen in the 90s. And I just remember thinking to myself, I know this is supposed to be the future, but I felt like the design of vehicles was actually going in the wrong direction. Yeah, like all of those Toyotas in the early 90s were all just very round. And then Ford had stuff like the Contour, but then even how they changed the design of something like a Taurus which had been like a more traditional kind of, sedan, again, all rounded off. Now, I think to some point it was meant to be kind of a throwback or an homage, if you will. Like we talked about the Mercury Monterey. There was a lot of really round vehicles in the 50s, and then things got more and more angular. But there was something about like that era with, excuse me, like vehicles like the Coyote or the Corvettes or some of the things that Lamborghini was doing at the time, like these body shapes that, I don't know, felt they were very interesting. And then they were going into like this weird plastic, I don't know. I feel like vehicles have gone backwards so much. I think about the troubles that I'm having with this Jeep that I have now, and it's all computer programming issues. It's motherboard stuff. It's brain stuff. Whereas there's another simpler time, which I'm sure if I had put the time and the effort back then into actually learning how to do it, there's a reason that a lot of people, even people who wouldn't be like super, mechanically inclined, could do a lot on their own vehicles that you can't really do anymore because you got to plug it into your computer to find out what's going on. I think that the simple mechanicals, the, big metal behemoths, there's just something about it that we'll never get back. And I don't know if that's good, bad, indifferent, if it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. I mean, certainly the lighter a vehicle is, the better it is for gas mileage. And some of the designs they've come up with are very, very safe, and I get that too. But I don't know. What have been the iconic vehicles of the 2000s? So obviously this show really kind of focuses more on this nostalgia stuff and 70s, 80s, 90s, but I don't know, maybe there's a bunch of really cool stuff that I'm just missing. I think the only thing lately that people talk about are things like, the Tesla vehicles that have come out. Cybertruck seems really interesting. Ugly as hell. Ugly. Has no, I don't know how to describe it. I'm sure it's an amazing vehicle, very versatile, but it's ugly as sin. And I just like the time where everything made sense, even like the layouts on your dashboard. I don't know. I think it's gone kind of the wrong way in some of that. But hey, vehicles of the 70s and the 80s, some of the 90s, what are your favorites? What vehicle is your dream vehicle? Like I mentioned, I would love someday to have a Mustang, but I would also be very, very happy with a Bronco. I'm a little bit more partial to the Fords. My dad was always a Chevy guy. My mom was kind of a Ford gal. I don't know if it's because I grew up in her house, but, some of the stuff that she liked, like Cougar's Mercury, and then she had all those Fords. Really, she had Fords up until, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago when she got her first Honda. Well, I guess that's more like 10 years ago now. But yeah, tell me, what are your favorites? And what are some of your, what of the ones on the list? What did I miss? I'm sure there's something I missed. Some of you might go, well, what about, Ferris Bueller? Okay, I don't talk about Ferris Bueller. If you guys have listened to the show, I don't do it. Well, what about the novelty vehicles? Like the Ghostbusters mobile. Well, I didn't really go with gimmicks, really. You know what I mean? I kind of went with like straightforward like vehicles. Cannonball Run. To me, the big vehicle in that was basically a converted ambulance, right? That Burt Reynolds drove. But somebody would be like, well, there was a Lamborghini in there, and there was Aston Martin because Roger Moore, was in there. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great, cool vehicles, but I didn't really go into any of the novelties, like Batmobiles, like those kind of things. I want to just kind of keep it simple and just not necessarily right off the assembly line, but pretty close to it. So let me know what you think. How do you do that? Well, you can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Leave 5-star reviews, like, comment, share, and most importantly, please, subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.